Hi, folks. Welcome to another episode of Film Study. This is Ken McKusick, and we have a short for you tonight on the integrity of the game in the face of more and more gambling and more conspiracies and also actual events that seem to be unraveling before us. Joining us to talk about that is Alan Frankel. Alan, how you doing?
I'm doing great today, Ken. Really excited to talk about this topic.
Yeah, I've long been one who said that it's very difficult to maintain the integrity of the game, but football's actually had an active hand in building more of a gambling culture around sports. It's certainly always been popular in terms of football. It's been one of the most heavily wagered upon sports, other than maybe football, soccer. It's probably the most worldwide, but it's always been a popular part of the game. Now the owners have made it easier to gamble even on site in a lot of cases, right at the ballpark with FanDuel windows and whatever else they may have there. They may or may not have direct relationships with gambling, but they certainly have gambling as very much a close ally of the sport.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it generates so much fan interest. It generates a lot of stakes for fans. Even if you're a fan of a team, it can be a way to even hedge your bets on your own team. If you're nervous that your team's going to lose, you bet on the other side. Maybe you win the game, you're happy. You win some money, you're happy. I've heard that's the popular fan hedge. But I think that one of the things that drives football's popularity with gamblers is actually the scoring system. How you can make up 14 points really fast, whereas in basketball it could take 7, 8 to 10 possessions to make up a 20-point lead. Football, you get a touchdown, you get a quick fumble, suddenly the game is back in reach. And I think that that's actually one of the core elements to it that I think really makes the sport go.
It certainly is one of the things that have made the game interesting. Period. Forget the gambling side for a minute. Just having games that are fairly close, and part of why close games occur is because of the function of second half football. Is you have one team who's trying like hell to catch up, and the other team's trying to kill the clock and get the game over with. And so it's actually the clock itself plays a role in keeping games close that I don't think that fans always are hip to, but it certainly is something that games are played for expected wins. They're not played for expected points, and that's something in the second half I think that is not completely embraced by people who analyze the game always.
Yeah, I can tell you that I actually have a very, very good football board game that I play. And one thing I've noticed is that it gets very different when you're the one in the headset. You generally run the offense, you run the defense, you coordinate the coverages, and you start to see all of a sudden with 14-point leads, in real time, people who maybe would say I got to be more aggressive with coaches to their own team suddenly will go back into those too deep shell coverages that they claim to hate. So I've had the experience with people who they'll say one thing and then I tell them, look, come in the headset. You're going to make the calls this game. Suddenly they have a slightly different tune. Once they've earned that 14-point lead and they've had to put the work in to get it, they're a little bit more prone to going more prevent, more preserve once they've earned it.
All right. Well, certainly it's true on both sides of the ball. You can play conservatively to try and hold the lead. But let's get back to the gambling topic here for a minute. Obviously, the NFL, a lot of their popularity is built on the fact that people love to wager on football, and it's more than any other sport. Hockey doesn't have that kind of a following. Baseball doesn't, and that's why the recent events are so weird. Baseball did. Back in the 19-teens, the culture of gambling in the United States reached an unbelievable height. Well, I'm sure we'll get back to that later. That culminated in the 1919 World Series getting fixed. But that doesn't exist anymore. I mean, not in the same way. But the introduction of the ability to bet online at any point in time, including on individual pitches, which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard of. It's the Clase and Ortiz thing is ridiculous on so many levels, but you start with the fact that people are betting on individual pitches, and the gambling establishment, the organization that loses money on those pitches, has every incentive to turn those players into their own leagues, and enormous sums of money were wagered not just on those pitches, but on the rest of their careers of those two pitchers who I am sure will never throw another major league pitch.
So you're hitting on a couple of interesting points. I'm going to go after them one by one and bring up the also the NBA, what just happened with Terry Rozier and Chauncey Billups. And in some ways, Terry Rozier kind of is the symptom of someone like Chauncey Billups. And we talk about the risk reward. It seems a little strange that players who could have multi-million serious contracts, real generational wealth, are willing to put it on the line. For certain gambling incentives. It feels a little counterintuitive. So how does that happen? And then when you look at kind of Chauncey Billups and his alleged, this is all alleged, innocent until proven guilty, alleged involvement with mafias, gambling rings, and putting players in compromised situations through rigged poker games. Very easy to see how something could go south pretty quick. I'm going to say two different examples that are potential problems. The first one is that a player is down a large amount of money in a short period of time due to a rigged gambling casino. We know that did happen. There was a rigged casino that Billups was involved in. Did he know about it? We don't know, but there was a rigged casino, so that could be a way for players to very quickly put on a lot of debt on themselves that suddenly they can't, they can't, make good on. And then they have to do things like manipulate pitches and things like that, like what Clase was involved in. The next thing, right, it's a problem is insider information. You get a bunch of athletes in a room, casinos, beer, alcohol starts flowing, maybe other things going on. Suddenly it's an environment where, hey, can you tell me if a guy's sitting or starting next week? Or in the NBA, especially where players are volatile game to game, are they playing? Are they injured? What's the game plan? Suddenly insider information can leak. And to me, when I think about Class A, I actually think that, Class A and Rozier are kind of the symptoms of what happens when you have a ring like what Billups was allegedly involved in.
Well, let's stick with Class A for a second, rather than talk
Sure.
about the general symptomization here. Class A is a guy who's making millions of dollars per year, and I don't know the exact amount. Maybe he makes 8 million, 10 million, 15 million. I'm not sure what, but he's the closer for the Guardians. I mean, obviously, is a player who should think very seriously about all his future earnings with regard to that. Most people in banking who work in casinos, who work anywhere around money, who athletes in basically almost any other situation, are so careful. They understand their future earnings are pretty much what they have. Their reputation fuels all of that, and it's exactly correct. If you steal from a casino, if you have some confidence scheme to beat them, you won't work around money again. It's not just for a casino. You really won't get a job around money again. And the amount of money that he's making, it should provide some level of insulation for this kind of blatant stupidity in terms of being talked into something like this. I don't know what his defense is going to be. I mean, he's going to stand trial for this. He may actually do jail time along with Ortiz. But I wonder, what's he going to say? Whereas you look back to 1919, players were making very little compared to the common working man in those days. Not much more. It used to be for a long time. It was basically professional athletes used to make about 7 times the working wage, and now it's many times that. So I'm just that did that additional money, that additional insulation, all the additional money we paid for advertising buy us nothing in terms of integrity?
So that's a little bit of where I was going. It's that there's some sort of negative event, and sometimes it's nothing to do with anything. Sometimes somebody has something bad happen in a family, just a tragedy or something that they can't afford to handle. That's a natural occurrence. But what I think happens to a lot of these players is they do end up in an unfortunate situation that they didn't foresee, whether it's a debt or they gave information and suddenly somebody has something they
Blackmail.
can hang over their heads,
Yeah.
blackmail. Like, I think that unfortunately these players do get entrapped in these situations. And I know that the NFL specifically, they do have people come out. I believe I've seen even I think it was Herm Edwards talks about it in one of his just 20 years ago. He did a speech on it before rookie players and things like that. So I know that they do have some things to try, and I know that the old players do try to be a resource for these guys, but sometimes players just get trapped. And I think that for a person like Class A, I don't know, maybe he'll end up being either found guilty or not guilty, but I think more likely he's going to probably have to settle in exchange for other information. Potentially, it's a dark road to go down. I honestly, I too am curious as to what caused Class A to get there, and I don't think we'll like what we find out.
It's possible. It's possible he could have debts. It's still relative future earnings relative to current debt. I mean, I can't even imagine, how serious that would have to be for him to feel like he had to sacrifice himself for this process. It's, you know, honestly, you look all across society, it's much more likely that somebody's disadvantaged, economically, is going to commit a crime. It's the nature of the world that people are more desperate when they aren't doing well in life. It's just not the case with Class A. It's really not. There's no excuse for it, and it was so heinously stupid in terms of traceability that, I mean, it's like the worst form of insider trading. It's like you heard about the RJR Nabisco breakup, and all of a sudden you bought 1 million shares of it 3 days before anything was announced. I mean, is that bad in terms of the flagrancy? Because extreme bets like this are going to be reported to the league directly, and I'm at a loss for the stupidity of the whole thing.
It's Bud Fox level for those familiar with the movie Wall Street. It's a Bud Fox thing where like eventually they're going to catch you if you keep being on the right side of so many of these trades. But one thing that I think one point you've brought up, which I think is interesting, is that all the people that are getting caught are all people that it seemed like were taking money from the casino. It was not about, maybe the casinos maybe having some insider information on events. It's all people who would have ended up taking from the casinos. It's not the casinos getting caught or any individual thing maybe having a tip on some of the games. So, the house always wins. And it looks like, once again, the house is going to once again walk away. And I think that a lot of people have some mistrust towards the casinos themselves about if they have any information leaning towards which lines are going to win and which ones won't. But all of the cases right now are all, people who are trying to win money from casinos. There was a big bubble of betting activity around otherwise relatively quiet props, and then they were caught because of that, all of a lot of props going in a very short period of time, or
Yeah.
specific concentration of activity. Like you said, it's if you looked on the chart, you mentioned some Wall Street analysts. I personally work at a bank. You would have seen this. The bubble went from up from a very small bubble in terms of concentration to a very large bubble, and would be
Mhm.
like, well, what happened here? Well, suddenly those bets all lost, and it wouldn't take long to trigger an anomalous investigation.
We'd take seconds to
Yeah.
figure out exactly what's going on. It's certain people betting these amounts, certain accounts, and they got limits in terms of how far they can do it. And then you find out they're Dominican accounts, and the pitcher's Dominican. It's not too hard to put the pieces together in terms of what happened. You may not have every attachment all the way through there in terms of how the communications went, but boy, it.
I'm just imagining Inspector Clouseau somehow coming to the wrong conclusion here.
Yeah. It does make sense also that the gambling institution, I'm not saying they're above reproach in this case, but their whole business is built on integrity of their games being, what it needs to be. They know well enough that they can't afford to be thought a cheater, or they'll lose most of their customers in a heartbeat. It's anyway, the Class A thing just ridiculous. You wanted to talk a little bit about the Donahue situation in the Western Conference Finals. I know from 2002.
I'd say my favorite thing about the Donaghy situation was that if you were a fan at the time, the Lakers and the Kings. Lakers, obviously, big market team, marquee NBA franchise. Kings, not necessarily a bottom feeder, but definitely nowhere near the cachet of your Celtics and your Lakers. And I think that, a lot of people pointed out that there was poor officiating throughout the series, and everybody said they were wrong. Everybody said, "You're sour grapes. You just lost. You're sour grapes." And, it turned out that they were wrong, and that there was issues going on in the NBA. So I think that the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I'm somebody who's, a little critical. Sometimes I try to follow the money. Money sometimes can lead you to interesting places, especially when you have big money, NFL stadium deals, a lot of things of that nature have definitely caught my attention, labor agreements. So when you have those types of situations, when people have maybe a alternative theory, don't necessarily when you're having conversation with those people, you don't have to think they're crazy right off the bat. Maybe they're seeing something that you haven't previously considered, and maybe they're only going to be right 5 to 8% of the time. But just for a second, take a breath and say, you know what? Maybe I need to look at that game and say, maybe there was something off. Maybe I should take another look at it.
Well, I'll say that is exactly what happened in the 1919 World Series, but there was an incredible amount of talk in advance about what had happened in that one. And so when the series actually happened, people already kind of had the feeling this series was about to be thrown by the White Sox, in that case, to the Reds. Um, it was a pre-conspiracy theory as opposed to a post-conspiracy theory, and they had too many mouths that couldn't keep them that couldn't stay shut, and too much money changing hands, frankly, in a short period of time. Too many losers who were incented to talk after the fact, and they still never got the guys convicted, which would have been a real win for baseball to clean itself up in that way. But they did get them thrown out of the game by Landis after Commissioner Landis after the 1920 season. But I did want to say this. That wasn't the end of it. I think there were 22 players from that era who were thrown out. And in fact, one of them could have been Ty Cobb, who is supposedly through the last game or was involved in setting up throwing the last game in the 1923 season. I bring that up in a relative sense because that was 4 years after. And the gambling culture is still so prevalent in the United States that there was an appetite for this. It's like, have we learned nothing? Is what keeps coming up in this. We have a Hall of Famer in Pete Rose, who's barred from the game for life, and had to die for him to basically be reinstated, kind of thing, in a sense. But what do you? There seems to be no limit to it.
There seems to be no limit to it, and we're this is generally a football show, and I can tell you that certain things from the league is also what causes these things. And sometimes it's strange decisions from a coach, like the Browns not kicking a field goal from the 29-yard line, electing to punt against the Raiders when it was right on the point spread. And maybe it was just Stefanski didn't want to humiliate the other team for an extra 3 points. Simple explanation. But when you have gambling, everything goes through the frame of gambling. So when you have two teams like I think it was maybe it was Eagles Packers, that Monday Night Football didn't have a lot of points. Two teams Monday Night Football, people were expecting there to be some decent offensive fireworks. Everything suddenly gets framed through gambling. It changes the fans' frame, and it's not only is it addictive, it's a rush for the fans. It gives them so much stakes that the level of focus on the game becomes really close. And I think that focus and that level of stakes is what's bringing fans into gambling, and they just don't quit. For me personally, I enjoyed doing it every once in a while. Out of sports gamble, I've since stopped because I realized it was just something that was taking too much of my life. But one thing I will tell you is that in the NFL, you have refs like John Hussey who have tremendous home favoritism, home bias, and the gamblers are onto it. And to tell you one thing, last week, people were talking to me about Chiefs Cowboys. The minute I saw Hussey was on that game, I said, oh, we might be in for something with this Chiefs Cowboys game, that the Cowboys are going to have an advantage. And they did. And there's been a few games which I've brought up. I know we talked about the Smith for the AFC title game. Since Smith has been a little bit more 50-50, it was a small sample, so I'm not going to go into that. But Warren Sharp puts out really great stats. Hussey is for sure someone who's there. He's roughing Colts Jaguars today. That's this week. That's one to take a look at. And the reason why it's a problem is that the NBA, in my opinion, did a good job. They put out something called the 2-minute report. 2-minute report goes through every single possible call in the last 2 minutes of an NBA game, and there's accountability at least for those final elements of the game. And they at least did something to show accountability. The NFL has variances by crew. It has, variants home and road, how teams are officiated. And to be honest, the rule book has only gotten thicker. Roughing the passer, what's pass interference? Ken, one thing I wanted to kind of pose to you as a question, just a fun question. If I showed you 3 random plays, and let's say I wasn't trying to be particularly nice, and I said, which of these 3 plays, I didn't say how many, which of these 3 plays got pass interference calls? How well do you think you'd consistently score well on that test?
Not if you're handpicking the plays, I wouldn't. If it was from a cross section of all NFL plays that somebody on TV mentioned that pass interference could have been called, then I think I do very well. But if you're handpicking the plays, no, I don't think I do well.
I think if I was
Because you'd pick counter to the obvious.
I was saying if I picked plays that I felt like were average, 50-50 type of plays, I I don't feel confident that I would score very well on them. And when I talk about penalties with my friends now, I've kind of adopted a different language where I'll say that's like a 65 percentile pass interference. So like Zay Flowers' interference the other weekend, I'll be like,
Hmm.
people say, "Ooh, I'm upset about the call. I don't like the call. Yes or no?" And I kind of think that calls are kind of on a spectrum.
Yep.
And, so I said Zay Flowers' PI was somewhere in 65% range where it could get called 6 out of 10, 6.5 out of 10. People are sending me videos. Well, here's a play where Hopkins pushed off and he didn't get the call, or somebody else pushed off on a different play more egregiously and didn't get the call. Personally, I actually did a video on the fourth down plays for the Lions and the Eagles. In the Lions Eagles game, the Lions had 4 or 5 failures on Sunday Night Football. Obviously, it reopened the fourth down conversation, going for it, not going for it. But one thing that I saw was that there was a fourth down play where there was a pretty egregious illegal contact on the targeted receiver and it did not get flagged. And then later in the game, there was a 50-50 call on the Lions that ended up, keeping the ball away from the Lions to get a tying drive at the end of the game. And I can tell you that just between those two plays and that snapshot, I was like, I don't know what to expect from this league. So I can only say things on a percentile level, and they don't come out and say, we got this one right, we got this one wrong. And I'm going to tell you why I think they do that and why the NFL getting in bed with Vegas is a very interesting partnership. Vegas is centered upon the fact that you almost won. Cherry, lemon. You don't win. When when fans could blame the refs for losing, they're not blaming their teams. They're like, "Oh, we could have won. We could have done this if we just would have gotten that call." And it invents this sort of near win fallacy. And when I think about the NFL getting in bed with Vegas, the professionals of the near win fantasy, that's something that, it gets my eyebrows raised. I'm like, what's going on here? It's an interesting situation.
Okay. All right. I can understand that. Certainly, that is they're exactly a group that would want to do that. I hate using the term Vegas to describe somebody. I mean, people do generally understand what it means. The gambling establishment, the people who are setting lines, the people who are doing that. It's us. We set the lines, largely speaking, because that line is dollar weighted. It's not count of idiot weighted. So it's one of the problems I have with what's going to happen to lines in 2026 is if the current tax law goes into effect as it's stated to be. And by the way, I don't believe that's going to survive the year, folks. I don't believe the only 90% of losses are deductible is going to survive this year and be in place in 2026. But if that does go into place, it'll make gambling less efficient as a predictive market. The gambling markets will be less predictive because you'll have to win that much more as a sharp in order to break even. I think there will always be a number of people who are willing to gamble and lose their money, even though they know they have an advantage, a disadvantage that's so large they can't overcome. There will always be people who want to bet football even under those circumstances. If you really had it mapped out for you under the new tax law, it would scare the living bejesus out of you in terms of how bad the situation is. You go from at a 30% marginal tax rate, you go from 52.38%, a well-known figure, 11/21, to 53.88%. You have to get right, and that is an Everest-sized mountain to climb in terms of additional required win probability.
So I am familiar with the tax law. I was actually reading up on it about 6 months ago. I read up on it. I'm trying to remember
Mhm.
exactly when it's played, but when I read that, I was like, they just think that people are hopelessly addicted to this, or it's some people are just betting such small amounts of money, 10, $15 each week. They're not thinking about the tax ramifications, and
Right.
they just don't see it. I can tell you that, like just like you're saying, like you think you can beat the house. I think I'm a relatively sharp fan, and I can tell you that
You can't do it. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
can't do it, and then at that tax, with that rule, you really can't do
And
it.
there's even more. I mean, you have asymmetric taxation in the United States, so you don't your wins get taxed, but your losses aren't deductible or carry forwardable the way your losses are on stocks. So it's a unreasonable tax system to start with. And then most other countries, by the way, gambling winnings are not even taxed. But I think, Alan, you don't have to worry about it because it was done for political reasons, not with. I don't think anybody thought what you just said. I think they thought basically we can show a way that this big beautiful bill is 8 billion less in terms of inflating the national debt than it otherwise would be. We'll put this in there with no intention to enforce it because we put it in a way that can't possibly be enforced. It's just too heinously stupid in terms of what somebody might have to do in terms of defining what constitutes an individual bet. I mean, literally, I mean, if I'm at a blackjack table and I'm betting hand after hand, am I supposed to write down every single hand that I have an exchange? Because every single discrete outcome, in theory, would be taxable and deductible at only 90%. Am I supposed to do it at the session level? Because that's the only level at which the casino will have records. Well, maybe. Am I supposed to do it at the trip level? Because that's the level I keep my records. I know how much money I went with. I know how much money I came back with. I don't really know on an individual, casino basis. So it's not it's not enforceable as is, which is one of the reasons why it's going to be killed. But the reason it was put in there at all in the beginning, I'm 95% sure, was political entirely, is to try and make the bill more palatable to a few marginal Republican people who are voting on it.
Well, Ken, I've got a lot of experience with ambiguous rules, having watched the NFL officiate roughing the passer. But I just want to, bring up one small tidbit of something that may have come out of it recently. For anybody who watched the Bengals-Steeler game, the Bengals before the half committed 3 roughing the passer calls, I think in one drive, and eventually injuring Aaron Rodgers, which obviously has consequence for our upcoming game this week. Eventually injuring Aaron Rodgers, and now listen, I'm not claiming bounty. I'm not going to make any outlandish claim like that. But what I do think happened was the Bengals realized we don't know what roughing the passer is. They can call it at any time. We're just going to hit him. If we have to live with the price, we have to live with the price. And when you have ambiguous rules, then you can kind of weaponize that, because if it's just a random, every 10% of time, every 15%, then we're going to incur it. We can't prevent ourselves from incurring it. So
Right.
we might as well get
That's
the
true.
upside of physically hitting the quarterback. And I was watching that game live and I saw Rodgers get hit and get hit and get hit. And I said, I don't think he's going to survive the afternoon, because the Bengals just don't care about incurring these fouls. And I thought the Bengals had a point. I thought, we don't really know how it's officiated, so we're just going to live with it. And it ended up knocking him out of the game and potentially impacting the rest of the Steelers season in a pretty large way.
I don't know how a game like football, which is coincidentally violent and open in terms of movement. So what I'm talking about with this, you can describe baseball in a state space way very simply. I can define baseball as having 25 states for base and out situations, for example. The only other sport I'm aware of that's that like discernible in terms of states is bowling. In terms of your what
Yeah.
pins you have standing which ball, that you can replicate that in a model pretty quickly. So baseball has been always fairly model about that. And there's plenty of other free movement in baseball. Don't get me wrong, but there's a whole bunch of constrained movement which limits your things. Now football, yeah, they have a field, but you're as long as you stay on it, the ball's still in play, and it just makes, they need to have rules to try and prevent injury, and they need to have rules to try and manage the activity that's going on the field. Already the rule book is, if you've ever taken a look at it, is an
Oh my
absolutely
gosh.
enormous and virtually unreadable entity. And it's out there now. If you look on, I think it's on GSIS, but it's on some other places too. NFL Operations has it, where you can look at it. I mean, I challenge you. This is something I looked up, and it took me about 2 hours of going through this before I could figure out exactly what was going on. But a blocked kick that goes out of bounds directly off a block, where is that ball placed for the ensuing possession? And try and figure that out reading the rule book. I'm not going to tell you what the answer is. Go back and try and read for yourself and see if you can figure it out. It is extraordinarily complicated.
Wow. That's an interesting question.
Mhm.
Maybe I'll have the answer next time I'm on your show.
Right.
I'll have
Fair
an
enough.
answer for you.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. Anything else we want to talk about before we get going here?
I'd say one more thing I want to talk about, especially with NFL games, is I hear people say that this team was quote unquote more disciplined just by looking at how many penalties were incurred. And, just mapping the game out a little bit, let's say there's about 153 plays, I think, in an NFL game, roughly 11 interactions. You have 11 interactions per team. So let's say for any given team, you just look at 11 times, 153. That gets you 1683 in total interactions for a game. That's just one interaction per player. There could be more. So if you have 5 penalties, that's like 0.00 something. If you have 7 penalties, you're still in 0.00 something. So aside from the fact that penalty calls can be correct or incorrect, just saying that your team is more disciplined because you had more or less penalties, it's kind of a rounding error. And that's something which I hear people talk about with different teams, whether it was the Patriots dynasty or other things, that this team is more disciplined. In my opinion, the only way to really track that as an idea is you have to look at every team, look at all the potential penalties that happen in a game, of which I've never heard someone do. Perhaps there's somebody who has done it. I have not heard it. But I would love to see somebody see how many potential penalties a team could have had, plays that could have been like 50%, like we talked about percentile wise, and then say, okay, they got called for this amount, but they actually committed a lot more penalties. So really, one team really could have been more disciplined than the other. It's just something that I thought was interesting when fans bring up the more disciplined argument. I just don't think it's been ever fully thought through.
Right. I mean, I don't disagree with you anyway on the topic, but one thing I'd say is start trimming the fat pretty quickly if you're trying to model that, and take out like false start penalties, for example. I mean, they're fairly cut and dried in terms of it. I'm not saying there's not one occasionally that will go the wrong way, like we saw happen. What game was it that was in the last Ravens game, right? That Falele and Rosengard supposedly both moved, but Murphy was already in the neutral zone.
I just immediately think of the Chiefs when I think of people jumping off sides. So I don't remember. As a matter of fact, I don't think the Ravens have ever committed a false start since I've started watching games.
All right, Alan. Great talking football with you again. Tell folks where they can talk to you online if they'd like to.
Sure. So you can find me on Twitter, FrankSports21, frequently replying to Ken's tweets. I always enjoy our dialogue. And you can find me on the Kickoff Podcast on Spotify. And I'm on DCL22's Discord. I'm pretty active there. So you can find me there too.
All right. All right. Very cool. All 22. Definitely content I would highly recommend. Other folks out there, please make use of hashtag Filmstudy Mailbag when you can. Trying to do more short videos around that. So if you have a question you think I can answer in between 1 and 3 minutes, I'd love to hear it from you. That's kind of 3 minutes, about the maximum length of a video that I could put out there on Twitter. I could put out longer, but it just people wouldn't watch it as frequently. But I appreciate it if your questions come in that way. And if the question is longer, still might be a great question. We'll try and get incorporated into one of the shows. Alan, thanks again for coming on.
No problem. Always great to be here, Ken.
I'll talk to you next time on Film Study.